working now? Is it? Oh, thank you. All right, I'm waiting for a couple more people, but then we're going to get started, and I'm going to be mindful more so than I was last week about ending on time. I promise. No. What's on time? It's supposed to end at 7:30, and we ended at 7:38.
Oh, shame on you.
I know, but it's important. And I know Rev Lynn has experienced that, how important it is to end on time. Yeah, they count those 8 minutes. Anyway, there he is. All right, I'm happy to introduce Aaron Strietzel. And his wife is here, Molly. Wave, Molly. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for the folks that are joining us streaming. Appreciate that. And Aaron comes from Durango, and he has been at the land since July of last year, and we're thrilled to have him. He has graduated from Claremont School of Theology 2017, and he's here to talk to us about theological, spiritual practices and the land. So here's Aaron.
Yes, I think I'm good here. All right. I need 2 mics. All right. Again, my name is Aaron Strietzel. Great to be with you here. Is there a camera for online? Is that like right back there? The red light. So thank you for anybody joining us online. So the title for today is, I learned a new word and it's super fancy, so I had to put it up here. Beyond the Anthropocene, laying a theological foundation. So let's go ahead and flip to the first slide there. The land has deep connections to hope. It was started by a former pastor here, Reverend Stephanie Price. So how many of you happen to know, okay, almost every single person here. Not intimidating at all right? So, all right. And how many of you are pretty regular attenders of the land that you show up? Can you raise your hand so everybody can kind of see you? All right. So I'm going to talk about the land, and it's a little bit scary because everyone here has been connected to the land a lot longer than I have. So I'm going to do my best to share a little bit about the land as we go along, and then everybody else can have the mic and correct everything I said that was wrong afterwards. So, Anthropocene. That was a word I learned about in 2022. By the way, in here in a second, I'm going to have slides that'll show some books. I brought all 3 of the books that I'm quoting from just in case. I love resources. I love books or podcasts or articles or just things because I think we constantly need to be absorbing different things. So if something I say and you're like, oh, that book sounds interesting, then it's here for you to check out afterwards and see if you want to, put money down towards it. But I was reading through a book titled When Time is Short by a man, I think used to live here. I'm not sure if he still does, Timothy Beale. But let's go ahead and flip to that first slide here. And he defines the Anthropocene. Can you guys all read that? Okay, good. I just got to look back here and just check. It's not quite big enough. You can't really read that back here. Yeah, okay. So I'm like, am I that good in that age? The term Anthropocene was first coined in the year 2000 to underscore the fact that we are now living in a world in which anthropogenic or human-originating forces have as much or more impact on the planet's ecological, geological systems as non-human forces do. Simple, clear as mud, right? Does anybody know what milestone we hit on November 15th, 2022? This is the, what? Oh my. Seriously, Molly, you had to go and ruin it all? My wife, all right. Did you really know that? Or did we? You guessed, good job. I was gonna say, this is for all the brownie points. I have one question, and my wife stole it from you guys. We hit the marker 8 billion people on Earth. Yeah, incredible. Where's Dr. Brewster? Jerry Brewster, raise your hand. You all know Dr. Brewster? Okay. So I know it's hard to tell, but he has a couple years on me. It's difficult. But we were at our winter retreat, John Wesley retreat outside of Divide, just west of Colorado Springs. Anybody been there before? It was my first time. Pikes Peak is like in your backyard. It's gorgeous. I was really jealous for the guy who's like works there. You get to live there on scene all the time. And Jerry and I, we were talking. I have an affinity for Jerry. He's a retired dentist, and my dad's a dentist. So, there's that going on. But we were talking about human population. And so I got curious because I'm like, oh, you got a couple years on me. How big was the world population when you were born? So we looked on Google. They didn't have Google back when Jerry was born, but they gave a rough estimate of about a little over 2 billion people. So just think about that for a moment. In one person's life here, Jerry has witnessed or been a part and experienced the quadrupling, 4 times the world population. So Anthropocene just is a fancy way of saying we humans are the primary cause of the geological, ecological change that we experience. Does that make sense? We're living in the midst of a crisis. So for all you smart ones out there, if you notice my title, Beyond the Anthropocene, and you're like, but the Anthropocene means that humans are the cause, how do we move beyond it when there's a growing up and to the right population? The reality is we don't. Beyond is human extinction. So there's that. Thanks for coming. Have a good night too. I'm glad I answered. So my title was my clever way of trying to come up with something and realizing, oh, that doesn't really make sense. The better title is actually a subtitle of his Timothy Beale's Finding Our Way in the Anthropocene. Navigating this fact that we're not going to escape the Anthropocene, meaning we're stuck in this world where us humans have a hold of how the future looks. So we're going to talk about navigating the Anthropocene. In some ways, I'm a pastor, so it's going to be sermon-esque in some parts. It's just what you get today. I won't dive too deep into any specific scripture, but we'll hit on that. We're going to talk first about theology and some of the causes that stem from Christian theology that have perpetuated at least some of the negative aspects of the Anthropocene. Namely, this idea of human exceptionalism. Have you heard that word before? So human exceptionalism just simply means that humans are exceptional above and beyond creation. Next slide. Here's a funny cartoon that I hope you'll get the ironic humor here of something of what human exceptionalism might look like. You overpopulated the land and destroyed everything, and then you have the bunny rabbit saying, sure, with the irony in the background. Human exceptionalism is really based on only 2 primary scripture texts. And next slide here. First one is Genesis 1, where it's often translated as humans have dominion over. If you've grown up in church, you know this. In Psalms 8, 5 through 6, humans are a little lower than God and have dominion over creation. I'm not going to unpack these texts, just to suggest that it's always problematic when you just take a couple scripture verses and you make a big theology around it, right? And not in light of the larger story. And we've seen this done in very destructive ways in slavery, in patriarchy, when people suggest that natural disasters were God's judgment sent on some people group. Are you with me? Does that make sense? So human exceptionalism. What I think, I'm gonna talk from my subjective perspective when I talk about the land. That the land, in my understanding, seeks to, in many ways, confront human exceptionalism and invite people to experience something else. I use the word experience very intentionally. We'll talk more about that here in a moment. So what is the land? Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. We talk about it as an outdoor United Methodist church that seeks to nourish the sacred relationships between the Creator and all of creation. And there's three primary ways we do that. Number one, food. Number one, faith. Number two, food. Number three, farming/conservation/ I don't know. So I did that on purpose because a little bit of the story, from my understanding, is the land was really started as an agricultural faith community, food, faith, and farming. And then we launched out like a lot of churches do, and you adapt and you figure out. And so a couple of things primarily happened. Number one, the land around us began to be developed. In fact, when I was appointed in July, I came down here in spring because we were driving through and I was like, what is this funky different place and where do they meet? And there was nothing around it. And then when I was appointed here in July, they were developing right up next door to us. So tons of acreage all around us, and eventually the whole plot will be developed. Not only that, but we had the plague break out, which is not a good transition. Like, welcome the new pastor, and the plague breaks out and kills off a lot of our prairie dog population. So I'm like, what do these people think of me? So, what was this? And the second thing was, folks started to meet outside and experience the connection to the created world and experience what it was like to worship and to be in fellowship and to meet on the land with the more than human community. And a couple of things happen. There's something beautiful when you begin to experience that, and there's a tension there. The beauty happens is that you're open to experience your connection and relationship with the world. There's a great prayer that I discovered from a 4th century saint. Let's go ahead, next slide. St. Basil, that captures this idea of a lot, I think, of what the land seeks to do in this connection. St. Basil wrote this prayer: enlarge within us the sense of fellowship with all living things, our brothers, the animals, to whom you gave the earth as their home in common with us. At least this is attributed to St. Basil. Enlarge within us the sense of fellowship with all living things. And that happens at the land. Am I right, folks? Okay, good. At least I'm sort of get what I'm saying. But it enlarges within us the fellowship of all living things. So there's a beauty here, but there's also a tension when things are developed. And we begin to wrestle, and we continue to wrestle as a leadership team with what is that third thing? How do we understand this? Because people begin to love it and want to conserve it, only it's hard to conserve not even 10 acres when everything else is being developed around you. And you live in this tension of how do we shape the land and how does the land shape us? If we don't see land as just a utilitarian purpose that we come in and kind of wipe out, but we live in relationship with. Does that make sense? And so we lived in this tension, and I bring that up because we're walking through that as a leadership team of what exactly does this mean now for us? But I bring it up because we all live in this tension, do we not? I mean, even at the land, every Saturday we worship at 10 a.m., and most folks drive a car 20 to 30 minutes to get to the land. So they put out carbon dioxide into the earth, right? Not a good thing. To come to worship, to learn how do we connect with and care for the land, right? So we live in this tension. We feel this tension. It's messy, isn't it? It's hard. Let's just name that. It's uncomfortable at times. I don't know how many times in the last year and a half where I'm usually driving and I'm in my own little dream world and I look over to my wife and it's like something just feels off. My wife like, yeah, you are kind of off, right? But do you feel that a little bit? Like something feels a little off in our world. And I think more, whether we're conscious of it or not, I think there's a growing level of anxiety based on our environmental crisis that humans are feeling more and more. And let me just take a little bit of a step further. If we as humans feel that, and honestly on the scale of humans and kind of our senses, there's a lot of other animals that have higher senses than we do. There's a lot of other living, created things, like trees and plants, that communicate to each other, that also feel things. How is this affecting them as well? We don't know, but it's an interesting question. And it brings up, when you look at this, it brings up grief. It's heavy. It should be heavy, and it does bring up some grief. And so one of the books that we read this past year, starting in January and February, we read a book titled Earth, God's Original Monastery. And the author here in the next slide, she writes this concerning grief. She says, the author and environmental activist Joanna Macy describes the power in letting ourselves experience our collective pain over earth. When we hold back, we become capable of acting in meaningful ways. When we repress pain, Macy says we tend towards three main coping strategies. Important here: disbelief, denial, double life. We have had difficulty taking in the reality of what is happening to earth, so we don't let ourselves fully grasp its magnitude. We continue to live in the same ways, maintaining a kind of superficial cheerfulness to get through the day. I confess I do this from time to time. Probably we all do. How do we hold this grief consistently? I remember when anybody see the Lego movie when it came out years ago? The song, "Everything is awesome." Sometimes I think of that, and then you just go out, everything is great, even though we know it's not, you know? It's hard to look behind the curtain. It's easier to believe in sort of the wizard, right? Or to deny. That's why I think a lot of folks still believe in denial of some of the crisis we face, because it's easier sometimes than coping with the grief. Comes up the reality of what we're facing. But we have to face it. One of the things I think that the land does is it creates space in a community where we can honestly look at the grief, look at our environment, look at the world, and say, we're in this together. And that's important. I'm hoping that when I said earlier today, when I said, I look at my wife and I said, some things feel off. You're like, yeah, I get that. I'm not alone in that feeling, yeah. And so there's an important aspect of coming together and confessing and sharing and grieving and lamenting and just saying it's messy and it's hard and we're not going to deny it. We're going to create space for it. But that can also lead to despair, especially if you don't have an outlet, right? If it's just like, wow, this is awful and overwhelming and there's so much to think about and there's so many new facts coming out, eventually you're just, ah. But if you don't have something to do, it can lead to despair. Next slide. Here's some pictures of some folks that come up. One of the things we do, and one of the things that I love, and I've inherited this, as you all know, from Reverend Stephanie Price and others, but one of the things that we do is we give people tasks. Do something about it. So in the summer, a lot of these photos are from our missions trip this past summer. We bring out youth groups and say, let's do something about it. Come out, help us. And our goal is twofold. Number one, they help us by building. We need help. So they build and they weed and they do all these projects, right? And number two, we hope that through that, they're also connecting to creation. And they're like, what are you doing? Why do you meet outside? What happens? Tell us about that. So they learn something about the process as well. And of course, we hope that they get to connect with each other, but that happens no matter what missions, where they're going. But ours is unique. So we give people something to do about it, right? Next slide. We also provide ways for people to get their hands dirty. We provide gardens. So Professor Oakley is in the house today. So if you notice that center picture right there, Hope and Les are up there, and then in the background they got those big water tanks. So we don't have water, so we don't have a pipe or faucet you turn on and off, so we have to get water shipped out there. And Clyde designed this in a way so it's a gravity fed, so it waters our gardens. He also designed that little underground storage tank that keeps our equipment when it's cold and freezing outside at a certain temperature and when it's too hot at a certain temperature, so we can go down there and put it down there. So what that means is I use any excuse whenever Clyde is out there doing something to just wander around and follow him and saying, this brilliant person, just, soak in that, right? But we give people a way during the summer to be a part of the land. Whether you're churched or not churched, young or old, you can come out, you can weed, you can plant, you can harvest. Last year, we donated over 650 pounds of produce to a food bank out of a Presbyterian church down the street that we partner with, so that when people come for food, not only do they just get those, boxed sets of whatever that has a long storage life, but they'll get fresh, locally grown produce as well. So it's doublefold. We get to give away some stuff. We also provide opportunity for people to do something about it. You with me so far? No one's fallen asleep yet. That's good. Next slide. Faith. We meet on Saturday mornings for worship outside. Our worship services typically look like this. By the way, any one of you is invited to come out on Saturday. And you don't have to skip Sunday morning worship with Pastor Lynn either. So there's always that. So we do a traditional call to worship. Songs vary from traditional to non-traditional. We're doing a kind of a series on Taizé-style worship for Lent. And we do a wander after that. And I want to take a side tangent here for a moment, because I think the wander is something interesting. It is what it sounds like. You just go out and you wander. And you ask yourself, am I being lured or drawn or enticed, or where am I being led? What seems interesting? We're south of the airport, so sometimes there has been planes flying over, and I'm like, I wonder if there's ever like somebody looking out the window being like, what are these people randomly walking around doing down there, right? But you wander. You experience a sense of connection to creation. And I can't help but wonder, how many of you have been out backpacking, hiking, biking, fishing, camping, doing something you've experienced a sense of connection to creation? It's important, so important. And I wonder, so wandering is like that, only you do something without an end game. I'm not catching a fish, I'm not climbing a mountain, I'm going to go out in a wild or semi-wild place or in a park, wherever, and just open myself up to God's presence and to what I see or sense or taste that might speak to me. Again, in doing that experience, it's a way to kind of circumvent our head and our theology of, in some ways, human exceptionalism, to say, I am connected to everything else. And God speaks through everything else. And I experience that, and I open myself up to pay attention to that. Then we usually do a song, some short sermon. We have 10-minute discussion. So after the sermon, we're usually a small group, and we can break out either 1, 2, or 3 small groups and discuss what stood out to you, what spoke to you about the sermon. So we in dialogue. When we have communion, we break bread together, and we sing. What do we do in the wintertime? Next slide. We gather together and we worship. This is my first question that came up when they were like, hey, what about this? And I was like, what do you do in the wintertime? It's always the first question that comes up. You meet outside. We pull down the flaps right there. On the top middle picture is what you see. We pull down the side panels. We bring in those little space heaters that if you've ever eaten outside or something and they have those little tops, right? So it keeps it 60 to 65 degrees inside. I've seen somebody in wintertime shed layers all the way to a t-shirt while we're out there. Not me, because I'm cold-blooded, but I've seen it happen, right? So we make it warm enough in the wintertime. We'll sometimes not do a wander because it can be cold, so we'll do another meditation practice, but we meet outside. I'm gonna kill this and not get us near that 7:30 mark. I'm gonna be a little early. So one of the key characteristics that I think makes the land unique is that, unlike nonprofits like the Prairie Conservation Center that's down the way from us, not far, is that at our core, we're a faith community. At our core, that doesn't mean you have to be a part of our church to be in different things. We have folks that come up and they'll help with weeding, that want to be a garden, that's their quote-unquote church. But at the core, there's a spiritual connection to God and to all creation that we're seeking to develop. So one of the other books that we read in the fall was a book titled Church of the Wild. And the lady who wrote this was there was a group of people that started this whole movement called Wild Churches. You can Google it, it's Wild Church Network. You can find them all over the U.S. And well, since it's out there, I'll just read it and then I'll share a little bit. She writes in this book, the layers of crisis and cruelty we face will not be solved with technological, political, or economic strategies alone. Alone is the key word there. A deep transformation of heart is necessary to welcome in a new story. And so there's this movement of wild churches across the nation, across the world. In the UK, they tend to call them forest churches. And they're people that are saying, we want to worship in creation. We want to get out and worship in that space. And the land was ahead of the curve. They were one of the few first ones that were doing something like that in that way. And now it's kind of taking off and people are realizing. And part of this too is if you ask somebody that doesn't go to church, but that still has a spiritual bent, well, where do you connect with God? What do they say? Nature, right? And so in many ways, we're providing an alternative that integrates some of that. But Victoria Lures, who wrote this book, was a traditional pastor for a time in Colorado, and then went out and worked with her son on environmental activism for a number of years and really got burnt out and exhausted by it. And what she realized is you can work for something, and after a while, you're so disconnected from the thing you're working for that you've lost the passion and the heart, right? So how do we connect and bring people into connection to fall in love with creation? It's an invitation to experience and to fall in love with creation. Do facts matter? Yes, they do. Technology, political, economically strategies matter? Yes, they do. But what she began to be passionate about and what I see central to the land is an invitation to fall in love with the created world. Next slide. Similarly, from the same book, Victoria Lures quotes from an environmental attorney, ecologist, and climate activist and said this. He's saying, I used to think that top global environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. But I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. To deal with these, we need a spiritual, cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. Again, as we gather for Lent and we learn about water and we learn about resources, those things matter. But what churches are set up for, in the midst of decline and our own church struggles, is we're set up for the possibility to create a community that brings about the spiritual transformation that is so essential. Make sense? We need a shift from human exceptionalism to human stewardship, and I would take a step further to an understanding and experience that we're a part of all creation. A shift from greed to care for others, at least as much as we care for ourselves. A shift from living what some people have called on the land to living with the land. Again, there's that tension. We shape the land shapes us. It's not like we don't do anything, but we're also not just there for utilitarian purposes. The earth is not an unlimited resource. A shift from selfishness to generosity and a willingness to sacrifice some of our own luxuries. The land is far from perfect. We're small. We're trying to figure out what it means, like a lot of churches, for our future and sustainability and finances. We're right in the middle of that. But here's what I would say from my perspective, and I will open it up to questions and for other comments for folks that have been a part of the land a lot longer than I. But what I've seen, what the land it represents is a faithful, prophetic community that points to an alternative way of seeing. Not it's bad to worship inside these walls or any walls. We don't believe that. I don't think anybody that attends believes that. I will probably at one point in my life be a pastor of another traditional church. It's not an either or, but one of the things the land does do is invite people to think a little, wait, what do you do? Why do you do this? bringing in a prophetic voice, a prophetic image that says there's a different way of being a person of faith, a spiritual person, a person that seeks the heart of God. So navigating our way through the Anthropocene, it's not just about rational arguments, although those are important and necessary. We need to learn. We need all angles. But what the land does, and I think it does well, and many other communities popping up across, and churches that are starting gardens outside all over and doing their own creative things, is it invites people to experience that connection, to fall in love with it. Because if people fall in love with it, then they move to see it from a utilitarian resource to something much more. Make sense? All right. Barely after 7. Okay. That was my talk. Now there's a microphone around here somewhere. Questions or comments for people?
Not really the land, but your beginning of your talk. Yes, I am. Whatever the word you use, it wasn't uneasy, but I'm uneasy about the lack of progress we're making in the world for environmentalism. But isn't our main enemy inertia? A body in motion tends to remain in motion, and also a lot of our decision makers are on the older side because they position of decision making by age. They don't like change either. So I'm not very optimistic about things. I have no solutions.
That's fair. Many days I'm not very optimistic either. And I think, how many of you will echo that and say, there's days that I'm not very optimistic? Okay.
Thank you for carrying on this vision. I know there was a grand plan. I remember seeing sketches on the wall and buildings that would eventually come and whatever. Could you kind of brief us on where you are in that grand plan?
We're in the midst of trying to figure out what we do with that. Short story is there was a grand plan of an amazing vision that was edible labyrinth and a greenhouse worshiping space and everything. And then after we realized that was going to cost a couple $1 million to go, we said, well, that's not practical in here and now, so we've adapted and we find ourselves where we are right now. And our leadership is navigating, okay, now how do we create a grand plan that, I don't want to say this, like isn't so crazy grand, but grand enough that we could, bite-size accomplish things. So that fits our budget, that works. What that will probably mean is it's going to be hard in the near future, but in the long-term future, it will probably mean us finding partnerships with other people and saying, we're probably going to be a smaller community, but how do we partner with other nonprofits or resources in developing a land that might work for us as a worshiping community, that might work for another nonprofit or two, and that might serve the community growing up, that might be a resource. So one of the big ideas that's not so grand but practical that we could do in the semi-near future is an outdoor amphitheater. That would also be a place where we could hold concerts and movies in the park once there's development around there. But we're basically asking ourselves, how do we serve the developing communities in the future? And knowing we have limited finances too, and that's an issue. Yeah, that's a good question. And so, yeah, did I answer it all right? Okay. Did I answer it all right, Clyde? All right.
Do you know of any other outlets like the land in other communities, other conferences, or is this unique?
I know of one other United Methodist church. I think it's in New York, and they're more new than us. They meet at a camp, United Methodist camp, and which is convenient, and then they meet inside during the wintertime, which is actually something we've thought, like, okay, how do we kind of balance that? What does that look like, too? That's the only other Methodist one I know. There might be other ones. There's other mainline ones. There's one in Texas. I think that's Presbyterian. And there's a lot that are kind of spin-offs or ministries of churches that are doing different kinds of things. There was an NPR article that came out recently of a church in Tennessee, I believe. You remember Clyde? I don't remember. But they were doing gardening and stuff like that and meeting outside as well. And so there's a lot of like little spin-off ones that are doing it. Yeah.
Who else would like to ask a question? Comment? Well, then I'm going to tell you something that you don't know. I have been involved in the land on a couple of different capacities. Couple summers ago, I was pretty involved with the hands-on and digging dirt and building doors for that thing that went down underneath. Anyway, my sister from Massachusetts came out, and I took her to the land, and she was so taken with what was being done. And we walked the labyrinth, and she felt that it was so powerful. And she loved the concept. She's taken it back to Massachusetts, and I think there is somebody in Massachusetts that's doing it. It's not affiliated with her church, but she and I always compare. What is your church doing? What is my church doing? She couldn't love the idea more. It's, and
Thank
we
you.
talk about it often.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for
So-
sharing that. That's cool.
Go the land. I'm all for it. I've been out harvesting there and, like I said, digging in the dirt and playing with dogs and stuff out there. And it's just, I love it. Even though I don't go there on Saturdays, I'm there in spirit.
What is your biggest challenges right now? And then, like, what kind of support do you need?
A couple $1 million.
Well, I help write grants for the conference.
Oh, yes. Yes. I mean, money is our biggest hurdle right now. And the leadership is trying to figure out, like, what does that mean and how do we navigate the future in a way that we could be potentially more sustainable in the future. And it's hard because I came in July. And so I'm like here in the midst of all of that. And so I'm grateful for the board that has been set up. But finances would be a huge help. We will be, I think, looking for partnerships in the future of people or things or ideas that might be able to help us in the future at the land itself. The most immediate thing, yeah, just being honest, money.
What was that world population figure in 80? Was it 80 billion? Is that what you said, or 8 billion? What was it?
8 billion.
8 billion.
Yep, today. Yep.
So that's a quadrupling in less than 100 years. We're gonna run out of food, aren't we, in the world? And water and maybe clean air. I mean, we are. I mean, that's. I don't know if that's a linear curve or a whatever a nonlinear curve is, but that's not sustainable.
It isn't. And it isn't sustainable. What do I want to say here? I mean, we're seeing a decrease in what is it, Molly? Huh? Fertility rates. We're seeing a decrease in fertility rates. That's good. And it's hard for people that are trying to get pregnant, but And the reality is, I'll just say this, I don't know how to make sense of this theologically, but the earth seems like it will continue. The question is whether humans continue. And how do we make sense of that theologically? That's the question, right? But we can't keep there. I mean, if you imagine that, then in my lifetime, we'll see, 16, 18 billion plus, right? So, and that can't happen.
Well, did God make a mistake in giving human beings dominion over the earth?
You have to say that in here.
I don't want to say it again. Excuse me, God, but did you possibly miscalculate when you gave human beings was that better? Miscalculate when you gave human beings dominion over the earth and all the other inhabitants? Because we've messed it up. I guess he's just kind of watching.
If God is omniscient. Yeah, so I would say, I think God has entrusted us, and God is not sitting back watching, I don't think, but neither is God controlling everything like a puppeteer. But if we look at the Bible, at least theologically, my understanding is God always works through people. I mean, God could have appeared to Pharaoh and said, let my people go. But God worked through Moses and said, will you go, right? And so we all have this invitation. Well, how we answer that is the question. So I would reframe the question in some ways. I don't think that's a fair question. God, what were you thinking? And also, humans, what are we thinking? All right? I mean, it's really up to us. And we've wrestled with that. Actually, in the book, not to be a downer here, but When Time is Short, he basically starts off with the question, it might be too late already. Might be, right? And in the midst of that, how do we live? What do we do? And the question then as people of faith too is, how do we as people of faith live? Do we fall into rejection? Do we fall off the other side into despair? Or do we figure out what we can do and open ourselves up? And sometimes I have hope, and I get all excited. I'm like, yeah, we can do this. And other times I'm like, oh my gosh, this is not going to happen. It's impossible. Our politicians don't even get along, right? So I hope I did. I brought enough reality with not enough drudgery in this.
I have this idea that the earth has its own self-healing powers, and that man needs to learn how to relay that, and not get in its way, and not like take over from the self-healing powers that the earth has. And I wondered if you thought that the attitude that the earth can be helped by man to heal itself is fruitful.
Yeah, I mean, you guys are like, geez, these are questions way above my pay grade. I would say my hope would be I think we can find healing through creation itself. And as we experience what creation does naturally, heal itself, renew itself, then can we find ways to work with that instead of humans coming in and sort of demolishing something, wrecking it. And so bringing that back a little bit to the land and other faith communities, we're trying to ask and wrestle with those questions, and not just intellectually, but also experientially. How do we experience our place in this? Because that will bring, I think, the needed transformation that can happen. What is it? Oh, gosh, it's slipping my mind. Agriculture, where you move it around and you shift it up and you plant here and crop rotation, something else. What is it? Regenerative agriculture. Same thing, sorry. But we were having a conversation at the land, like, where do you find hope? And one of the guys, he's actually going through the ordination process. He's a hospice chaplain, Isaac Dunn, was like, regenerative agriculture. Like, if you look at how we could do agriculture, instead of like kind of monocrop and use a bunch of pesticides and kill like the topsoil, if we do regenerative agriculture, everything begins to flourish. So again, back to your question a little bit, if we as humans figure out how we can approach things, not just for greed and utilitarian purposes, but work with it, then we can. I don't think the answer is yes, it's going to happen, or no. I think it's a big question mark of like, what do we do with it? Lynn.
I was reading an article about how in some places in the world, like in the United States and in Australia and in Canada, there are cities that are turning to the native people, to the first peoples, and asking them, what do we do?
What do we do?
And in those places, the land is coming back and there's enough food for everybody there because they're going back to the traditional ways of treating creation, which I think is kind of fascinating. So maybe there is hope.
Yeah. Thank you.
Other comments?
Oh yeah, I just want to comment a little. I mean, it's certainly easy to look at all this and be so discouraged, and it certainly is. And then you look back at what Jesus was facing in the Roman Empire and his ministry, and talking about, we're just yeast. It's just we're spreading this kind of a message throughout, and that message indeed has grown to be billions of people, for better or worse. But I mean, I think that one of the promises of the land is to be that kind of yeast in an environmental sense, is to really do things in an exemplary way, and to make that a part of your conversation with other people, and try to get that sense of responsibility in terms of nature and how humans can live with that and serve both human interest and the Earth's interest somehow. I think after you do get it started, then it becomes a matter of faith after that.
Thank you for sharing that, Clyde. Yeah.
Anybody else? So next week, we have an opportunity. We have a lady that is going to be speaking about what the legislation is doing and what we can do in terms of contacting our people that represent us. So stay tuned and come next week. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn.
I have a handout here that is what the Hope United Women of Faith are doing. So if anybody would like one of these, I would like to give one to you.
The bumper sticker we used to have on the car that said the population bomb is everybody's baby. You can kind of tell that was a while ago.
That's, yeah.
Back in the 70s. Two facts. 60 million years ago, plus or minus, the asteroid hit, destroyed the dinosaurs. They say the volcano at Yellowstone has gone off 3 times, the last 600,000 years ago. They say if that goes off again, there will be enough ash in that will collapse buildings in Denver. What I'm getting to is all of those things were external to human beings. What we're doing now, we're doing it to ourselves.
Yeah.
And it's not just United States.
Yep.
It's the world.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you.